Stanford University.
Today's class session is on data privacy, ethics, and policy, teaching AI ethics, responsible limits on data and technology, and new governance frameworks. We have a fantastic group of panelists here today. And quick context for today's class is that there's a lot of questions that surround the ethical use of AI and personal data, and especially as AI is being more and more integrated in our daily lives, there's been a lot of heated debates both in the public and the private sector, and we're going to try to answer some of those pressing questions surrounding AI ethics today. So wanted to start off with introducing our panelists, and Rob, we'll start off with you. If you could just provide a little bit of background about yourself and specifically as it relates to this class session and the topic, that'd be very helpful.
Okay, thanks a lot for inviting me to participate in the class, and nice to meet all of you. My name is Rob. I'm a professor in the political science department, and I'm a relative newcomer to topics concerning AI or technology, but I currently am an associate director of the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. That's the newfangled thing here on campus called HI, which aims to provide a vision of AI's future that doesn't give AI scientists alone only permission to push forward the frontier, and says to social scientists or humanists or philosophers like me, we get to study AI once it's been released into the wild and we have no other role. The idea behind HAI is that social scientists and humanists and philosophers like me should be present at the moment of creation, ethics down the whole product development pipeline, design ethics through and through, and that will be likelier to bring about a future in which AI is harnessed to support rather than to reduce human interests. So that's probably the main connection I have to your class, but I'll also mention that I spent an entire year developing with Mehran Sahami, who's the most popular professor at Stanford measured by class enrollment. He teaches CS 106A. I'm guessing many of you in the room have taken it or at least know of him. A class with him and a colleague of mine in political science named Jeremy Weinstein. He's served at the highest levels of the National Security Administration of the Obama government. And it's a class on the ethics and politics of technology and technological disruption. We just finished teaching it this past quarter for the second time, and we're currently writing a book about the material in it. I also run the Ethics Center on campus. I'm a philosopher. I guess that's relevant.
Thanks, Rob. Heather, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Heather Evans. I'm the Director of Frontier Technology Research at Asia Society, which is a reasonably new role, and how it connects to AI dates back to my previous life. I was an AI entrepreneur. I had a deep learning company. We failed. It sucked. I was then at a dinner where I made fun of a woman who worked for the provincial government of Ontario. I'm a Canadian. And then she hired me. So I actually became a bureaucrat, and I worked on the Pan-Canadian AI strategy before it launched in March 2017. And my role was effectively to explain to bureaucrats and stakeholders and politicians about the limitations of, or sort of manage expectations about what artificial is and is not, and also look at national strategies and how they evolve. I then went to Schwarzman College at Tsinghua, where I studied last year. And that's how I was connected to the Asia Society, who was interested in getting involved in AI, and I had a lot of opinions about that again. And so what I'm working on now is what we're calling technology diplomacy, but basically it's looking to develop more of a process to find areas of consensus and map sort of consensus versus irreconcilable differences related to fast-changing technologies and adversarial regions. So I'm focusing on the United States and China and issues related to AI, which I'm happy to speak about a little bit more. But as it connects to data, also when I was a government person in a prior life, I helped with a now dismantled data strategy. We had a political change where at the level of government I was working at, but there was a very big issue when Alphabet was going to create something called the Quayside Project in Toronto. It's a connected part of the waterfront and developing it. And it was then sort of determined that we didn't really have any measure of how we understood our constituents and our population feeling about data privacy. And this is also around when GDPR was announced. And so I've had a little bit of time to think through and work with people who thought through to a much greater extent how different collections of privacy and how they're viewed. And when I was in China, I studied the notion of privacy and the applications of GDPR in China, which is the Personal Information Security Standard. Unfortunate acronym, but very interesting. So that's kind of me at a very high level. I wish I was with you all in person, but it's also fun to have this ridiculous virtual background and be here virtually.
Thank you, Heather. And last but not least, Shuman, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. And thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to speak with you all. And
This is a topic that I care deeply about and have been thinking about and working in for some time. I'm global head of AI at F5 Networks. If you're not familiar with F5, F5 is basically powering all of the web applications and mobile applications that we're using today, and particularly now more than ever in terms of how much we're using the internet to be able to do things that we previously did physically just a month ago maybe. And the way that I came to F5 is F5 acquired the company that I was CTO at called Shape Security, which was responsible for protecting the same types of applications, all the big web applications and mobile applications for the big banks, airlines, retailers, government agencies, and so on. Prior to that, I was at Google for a number of years, where amongst different projects that I worked on, I founded and co-led our Privacy Council, which had a view into data privacy issues across the entire company. And one of the very first projects that I worked on as a product manager was the launch of Gmail. And that was one of the earliest cases where we started having very rich conversations with the public and with various privacy commissioners around the nature of data and how it relates to protecting our users. So really excited to be here, and I think that this is a very important topic for us to discuss at this particular time as well, because there are some very clear trade-offs that are being discussed around data privacy and security in a way that I think resonates more with people than ever before.
Thank you. I'm thrilled that we have both the perspective from the private large company perspective as well as the policy government perspective, and then of course the philosopher academic perspective. So I think this will be a very rich discussion today. I did want to start specifically with data and data governance and privacy and the ethics around that. The way I think about it is that throughout human history, forgetting has been the norm and remembering has been the exception. But nowadays with Google, Facebook, the NSA, and a number of other organizations, forgetting has become the exception and remembering has become the default. So there's a growing trend towards mass surveillance, and the internet really doesn't forget. A question that's probably on everyone's mind regarding privacy is, let's talk about something that's very relevant today, specifically around surveillance, and some countries have been using that to help fight the coronavirus. Question for our panelists. First question is, should the US government increase surveillance to help fight the coronavirus? What are your thoughts on that?
You have any vision, Ernestine, who should go first?
We'll pick on you, Rob, since you just spoke up first, so.
All right. Yeah, that's what happens for speaking up. Okay, so, well, I want to answer in at least two straightforward ways. So I think that the coronavirus pandemic has revealed indeed an extraordinarily important public health need for what I'll describe as public health surveillance, which would be indeed a variety of different technologically enabled tools that would be not necessarily privacy abusing, that's what I want to come to, but they would certainly be tools of surveillance for diagnosis, contact tracing, as well as notification if you happen to be in the neighborhood, the vicinity of someone who was symptomatic and could be a source of contagion. So yes is the short answer to the question about whether the US government should look to forms of public health surveillance to help manage and mitigate the other responses to the pandemic. But secondly, what I want to say is that I think there are technological approaches to promoting public health surveillance which don't have to be as privacy abusing as so many of the ubiquitous tools that we currently have at our disposal. So if what the tech community does in this particular moment is rushes in to meet the legitimate public health surveillance needs by promoting products that are further privacy abusing than the already ubiquitous surveillance tools in our hands and in our desks, that will be an enormous loss for humanity that is short-sighted, although understandable. So I could point to technical approaches that involve things like on-device processing and various forms of anonymization of data that go some measure toward public health surveillance without amounting to an increase of the surveillance panopticon that is already creeping upon us.
So if we start with public health surveillance, do you feel that from a government perspective, it might then end up also doing surveillance, for instance, around finding people for traffic tickets, or for instance, trying to track down a criminal or an individual? Like, where does this start and stop? anyone can take that on. Otherwise, we'll just keep picking on Rob. So
I think that is exactly the concern. So as Rob was describing, if you do this in a way that is very broad, then people are going to come up with additional use cases for those connections and those data that weren't in the original scope. And they'll say, you know what, it is kind of beneficial to be able to use this data to be able to find people who are committing minor crimes, or to be able to predict who might create, some kind of disturbance. And you can imagine how this slippery slope goes depending on the nature of a particular government. And I think that one of the things that makes this a very timely and difficult discussion is the way that society approaches these sorts of decisions and trade-offs is very much influenced by how scared it is and how desperate it is. So if coronavirus had a much higher case fatality rate, if this was threatening the destruction of the entire human race, which it's not, but if it were, then we would be thinking about everything else in a secondary manner. We wouldn't be thinking about data privacy at all. We wouldn't be thinking about anything other than pure physical survival. And we would use everything that's available and more in order to be able to protect the entire species. But similarly, if you go on the other side of the scale, and if it were at 1/100th or 1/1000th the case fatality rate that it seems to be right now, then we would say there's no way that we should expand government powers in order to be able to deal with this. So the problem is it's in the middle. People are more scared of this than they've ever been of anything else before. There's been nothing quite like this before. So society is asking itself, exactly how extraordinary should our measures be in order to be able to protect against this? And we've already seen examples of this in terms of sheltering in place in a scope and a scale that has never happened before. So I think that in terms of what a government should do, I agree with Rob. They should look at the options that are available, and they should examine them very carefully in terms of what the potential benefit would be, what the real benefit would be based on evidence that we have. And also from a technologist's perspective, I think that there are technological solutions that allow us to be able to get a lot of benefit from that data and from that technology without necessarily making it overbroad. So for example, if what you care about is being able to identify specific clusters in the context of contact tracing, then there are ways to potentially do that that don't require you to have a full data set on every individual where you can identify all of those individuals. If you can narrow things down to a neighborhood or to a city level, then there are certain measures that you can take there in terms of rolling out additional testing, for example.
Heather, do you have any thoughts on that, especially based on your background working with the Canadian government?
I think when it comes down to considering privacy, it's always that lovely tension between security and privacy. So security can be defined in a lot of different ways. And looking at what's going on today with COVID-19, the health concerns about our security from a health perspective likely outweigh for many individuals how much they value access to certain types of privacy. And it's been really fascinating to look at the responses to this outburst in different parts of the world where there are different government regimes, and there's also a different relationship that individuals have with adopting new technologies, or with kind of a notion of a more collectivist area as opposed to an individualist society, like I would say exists more in the West, in the United States. So as Shuman mentioned, an issue with any sort of additional access or reach into using an individual or accessing information about someone, it's very difficult to roll those things back. And I know that a lot of privacy advocates right now are quite concerned that the coronavirus is going to be a reason that a lot of personal freedoms or privacy is eroded, because clearly at this point, the need for security is weighted for many individuals as being higher and more important than their privacy. But I will also say that there are, again, building off of what Shuman said, a lot of examples of privacy enhancing technologies. I think that's what that's what the forum's calling it these days, but different technological solutions that enable more protection for certain pieces of more important information, let's say, being more difficult to access. I mean, the other thing that's interesting always to keep in mind is that we have this notion of privacy, but at many points it can be compromised. And I think on average, individuals, myself included, have a reasonably low understanding about what information individuals or other parties are able to access about us, just because of how connected the world that we now live in is.
And especially with the changes that you've all alluded to with the coronavirus, and we have started down this slippery slope in many ways. what should we or what can we be doing to make sure that we're not continuing down a slippery slope post-coronavirus, post-pandemic? How do we roll back some of these measures, especially if in the future, for instance, there's another virus outbreak that occurs? We don't know the severity level of it. We don't know the impacts, and governments around the world immediately go to a stay-at-home quarantine orders just because we've already seen it happen already. Like, is that something you guys expect will happen, or are there ways we can mitigate that, or should we even mitigate that?
I'll jump in with, I think I'm someone who definitely looks for silver linings. And if you look at the responses of countries that had a higher outbreak of SARS and their ability to respond to coronavirus, I think there's a compelling case to be made that there is systems in place that enabled a faster response, which of course saves lives. And while I'm a silver linings person, I'm also a realist, and I think it's probable that we'll see another pandemic at some point. And so it would be irresponsible not to take a pretty critical look about how different regions of the world are responding to this and looking at better solutions to respond in a less intrusive and faster acting manner. So on that note, I hadn't heard about public health surveillance as a sort of area before. And I think I'm so happy it was raised. I've written it down. I think that's a great way to bucket different types of tools. And if you're designing these tools and if you're using like privacy by design principles, let's say, then there are ways that you can create and share tools that are not as intrusive for an individual's privacy. And you can see with the European Union right now, which would be, as a jurisdiction, definitely the leader in terms of prioritizing privacy of citizens' data, of course, because they launched the Grand Data Protection Regulation. They recently put out a call, and perhaps someone else on this call has more information than I do because I haven't looked into it as much as I'd like to, but they're pretty serious now about using types of applications in order to better track the spread of this virus. So I guess to sum up, I think we will see another pandemic. The silver lining is that hopefully as a society, we can learn from the best examples of how to manage an issue like this so that in the future, we don't need to react in the way that we have, and we can also save more lives. And as new tools are being developed, if they're really using privacy enhancing technologies or they're incorporating privacy by design principles, then I'm optimistic that sort of not all personal privacy will be completely eroded. But of course, I'm happy to be challenged on that.
I think the easiest way to roll back something is to create mechanisms that roll them out initially that create a great desire to roll them back when you're done. So think about sheltering in place, for example. When the pandemic is over, people will stop sheltering in place because they don't want to keep doing that. There's a very great incentive to change that behavior. If, on the other hand, you've got this implicit data collection that the government starts enabling or tech companies start enabling, there isn't a direct incentive or public visibility or an outcry to say stop doing that if it's not directly causing people pain. And if there are folks that are saying, well, there are other uses for this data now that the pandemic is over and we should keep doing it. Or even if they say, maybe we do want to roll it back, but we have priorities in terms of where we invest our IT resources. So decommissioning that project is not the highest priority because it's not hurting us right now. There are all kinds of different ways that something can be implicitly not rolled back. And so one way that you can structure things in this area so that they will be rolled back is through apps that have been created that are specifically for this purpose that many people, not all people, but many people will uninstall from their mobile devices after the pandemic is over and after they don't have a need for it anymore. Or you could even explicitly decommission that app. But I think that you have to make sure that sort of rolling back is going to happen as a result of people wanting it to happen.
Rob, do you have additional thoughts you want to add to that?
I guess I want to take a slightly bigger framework to the question, which is that if we only ask ourselves how to limit, the advance of various privacy abusing surveillance techniques in the moment because of the urgency of the response to COVID-19, and then worries that it's once in place, it's hard to dial them back. You just heard a couple of different examples of how we can do that. I'd like to think about this in the broader perspective in the sense of challenging anybody with a technical background to devote themselves at least partially to the exploration of how various forms of privacy protecting technologies or technical approaches can be baked into many more of the ubiquitous products and services and platforms that we use, so that when it comes to a crisis, we don't have to think about throwing everything at the wall we can to stop the crisis and then worry about, will government now have too much information that we would never have permitted or wanted in the absence of the crisis. If we have a bunch of technical tools at our disposal that are privacy protecting from the start, we'd just be in a much better situation than we are today. And I'll offer up as Exhibit A today, in my view, about this. We're using Zoom. You all, I'm sure, have read about some of the security and privacy controversies with Zoom, which was developed for, a kind of business market. And the CEO claims never envisioned that it would be used for the different use cases now across the entire world. But was, to my mind, shockingly quoted in the New York Times today as saying, if not for this crisis, we never could have imagined the privacy or security issues on Zoom. I mean, it's only because of this crisis that these even occurred to us to think about, which, given the green lock on the top left hand of our screens, which a week ago said this call is end-to-end encrypted, and now we know that it was completely fraudulent, seems like an avoidable orientation that the people at Zoom could have taken earlier on. All of which is to say is, if the technology world's response to a privacy and security crisis like is happening at Zoom, now that it's being used at scale by so many people as essential infrastructure, is the best that we can do, then we're in really bad shape as a society. We have to ask our technologists and public policymakers to build privacy protecting approaches into the technical stack from the beginning of computer science education, not as a response to crisis.
Mm-hmm. That would be great if our government and policymakers were able to think and have that foresight. You did
Ernestine, I have to add there, it'd be great if the venture capitalists and founders did too.
Rob likes to pick on me and all of us in Silicon Valley, which is well warranted. So follow-on question to that. So for instance, Rob, you mentioned end-to-end encryption being one instance, and there has been debate, really heated debate, probably about 2-3 years ago, around should the government have a backdoor to that, for instance, but then that defeats the whole purpose of end-to-end encryption because there's a potential security breach because of that. But then at the same time, the government should have some sort of oversight if, for instance, there is terrorists who are using an end-to-end encrypted messaging platform to communicate their plans. Going back to a question specifically around what should businesses and also governments be able to do with our personal data that we might be using on a business platform, for instance. There's really no uniform policy or protocol to regulate data ethics and really ensure individual privacy, aside from the closest would be, Heather, you mentioned the EU's GDPR policy that's been in effect, but how much of our personal data should businesses and governments be able to own and do anything they want with it?
I'll jump in quickly. Also, to the earlier point that, or I guess Ernestine and Rob, you both sort of made about the government's role in this. I was interested to start reading a little bit more about a proposed bill from a senator out of New York called Gillibrand. My Canadianness is showing, so I don't know all the Congress members very well yet, but she proposed and has a great Medium article dated February 12th about a data protection agency, sort of having it as a referee, independent federal watchdog group, which would arbitrate and enforce rules to defend the protection of personal data. I will say that in her Medium article, she kind of talks about 3 core missions that are quite broad, but the first being that Americans should have control and protection over their own data, enforcing data protection rules. The second being that the government should be able to still galvanize the best technology centers in the world. And the third is to prepare the government for new technologies, which she later expands as being that this data protection agency should also be able to tell the government everything about emerging technologies and threats that they have as they're kind of coming up. And from my own personal experience of sort of doing that for the Canadian government, it's very, very hard to do that. So I think it's a very overarching, large statement, but this bill was introduced to Congress, I think, just at the end of March. And I don't know what's happened with it since, but on the topic of kind of how government can proactively be involved in this. I think it's for everybody in the group, it's worth looking at and thinking critically about whether or not that's an appropriate response and if those missions are achievable and enforceable. And she also provided 9/11, kind of the Department of Homeland Security was really bolstered after that and was saying that at this time, there's a definite need to have a more critical look at what data is being created, who has access to it, etc. So on that note, what's fascinating is that if your data is being created, basically, you could kind of put into the bucket of either like the company can see it, no one can see it, or like the government maybe can access it. Different people have different levels of trust with state versus with private companies. It's my interpretation that in the West, typically we trust private companies more than we trust the state. Although that is interesting if the state exists to provide essential services to all of its constituents, and in theory, a private company exists to maximize profit for shareholders. So I just kind of raised that because, of course, the question is what information should private companies be able to access as well as the government be able to access. And I think in most cases, a lot of the data that's been collected about us does make our lives a little bit easier to lead. It's nice to have, maybe you don't feel like it's nice, but sometimes I appreciate that it's easier for me to find things that I want to search for because there's information about me and what I'm kind of looking for as a consumer. And if I have a little bit more information about how to navigate effectively to a location, I sort of appreciate that because I can get there more efficiently. But there's another whole suite of information about myself that I would probably prefer that both state actors and private companies didn't readily have access to. And of course, that's a very sort of individual preference. And it's very challenging to properly navigate a large, vast, diverse group of people and understand what their preferences are. And then there's the other piece of saying, like individuals say, oh yeah, we want privacy, but then they won't pay for services that are available to them for free because the business model is that you're then able to target ads. Or I guess kind of what we will say doesn't reflect our actions. We won't navigate away from a platform because of a breach necessarily. So I really didn't answer the question. I just provided more questions, but I will look at that and see what Rob and Shuman have to say.
Shuman, if you have something, go ahead. I've got an idea as well, but you go first.
Sure. Well, Ernestine, I think you asked the question in a very interesting way, and I haven't really thought about it that way before because I was taking it literally first. What types of data and information should companies not be able to access? Because the way that we usually have the conversation is an individual can put whatever data they want into an information retrieval system. And so then if the individual has consented explicitly to that company having access to that data, then that's generally okay. So I've got an Apple Watch that's monitoring my vital signs all the time. And that isn't data that I would necessarily choose to share with other companies, but I'm perfectly fine with Apple having access to that data. Now, would I be okay with Apple then using that data for unannounced purposes? Or would I be okay with Apple using that data in the context of government activities that might be legal, but I might not be aware of? I think that those are where a lot of the interesting discussions happen. And so I think that a big challenge here is that government is always going to lag what is happening in the technology industry. So just as soon as the government can get its mind around Facebook, you've got Snapchat. And as soon as they figure out Snapchat, you've got TikTok. And it's always going to work that way as long as you want to also pursue innovation as a society. So you can try and make the government move as quickly as possible. And I think that they should. I think that they should always try their very best to be able to establish principles for society and requirements on corporations when they can see that there are generalized rules that would benefit all of society and would be extensible for some period of time. But it's really difficult to envision all of the different things that technology might do in the future, even the near future, and all of the uses of data which is collected for one purpose today, tomorrow. So I think that what you really want to do is make sure that while the government is doing the best job that it can, I'd go back to Rob's point, there is a real responsibility that the technology industry has, and there's an opportunity that technologists have to be able to say, this is a set of issues that society cares about, and obviously the government cares about as well. We're going to innovate from a technology perspective in order to be able to pursue those goals at the same time as other innovation goals. And so an example of that was Gmail was one of the very first systems to have true end-to-end encryption, not just HTTPS on the login form, but HTTPS encryption throughout every single page that you access. Now, when you think about that today, it's mind-blowing that that's not the way that web applications operated in the past. But back then, HTTPS was just slow because CPU power was much lower than it is right now. And so people would say, oh, it's going to slow down the website. We shouldn't encrypt everything. And now that has evolved to the point where Google is even penalizing websites for not being encrypted. So that's a great advancement in terms of technology improving to the point where we don't have to make that particular trade-off. And I think that there's the opportunity for privacy technologies in particular to be able to help with these problems.
I'll give a brief two additional thoughts here. The first is that if you're familiar with the GDPR, European Union's General Data Protection Regime, one of the provisions in the GDPR is that companies that collect data have to abide by what the GDPR calls data minimization. You have to collect the minimum amount of data to accomplish your business purpose. I'd love to see something similar either in US law or adopted voluntarily by technologists, because I think the more common practice is data maximalization. We'll collect as much as we possibly can because downstream there might be a monetization opportunity if only we can collect everything we can. That it leads to various of the abuses and harms that we kicked off this discussion with. Secondly, I'd point to the fact, echoing Shuman here, that the technology industry is in what I would say is like the unruly teenager years of life, thumbing their nose at authority, trying to figure out what their various powers are before settling into a more mature, stable form of existence. And government is trying to catch up in order to enforce that more mature, stable form of existence. If you think about yourselves as students, you might know that there's a federal law called FERPA, the Federal Education Record Privacy Act. So that last quarter in a CS course, there was a TA who gave the roster of all students enrolled in the deep learning class to a private company, thinking that it would be nice to do to recruit people because they were doing well in the class. That student was fired as a TA because it's illegal to share private information for educational records with people outside of the institution. In healthcare, you have HIPAA, the Health Information Privacy Protection Act, which forbids hospitals from collecting and marketing their data in ways that they collect on the private aspects of health. So what I would propose is that there is some, so it seems to me, low-hanging fruit for federal legislation on privacy, and that's to begin with biometric information. Our biometric information is data that is inextricably tied to us and that we can't ever change. Once someone has our retinal scan, our DNA code, our face print, we can't get another one. And so once that's in someone else's hands, that's really the horse out of the barn permanently. So I would think that we need, a data protection act for privacy of biometric information as a way of inching toward a broader based set of legislation and commonplace norms across all of industry.
There's a great example there that illustrates that principle as well as an earlier point you were making, Rob, and that's the way that Apple implemented Touch ID. Yeah. So they made great pains to ensure that everyone understood that they were not creating a giant database of fingerprints. Because if they were to create a giant database of fingerprints and someone stole that, that's it. The fingerprints of everyone who uses Touch ID are now in the hands of cyber criminals. Right. And as you pointed out, you can't change those fingerprints. So instead, what Apple did was they used technology to be able to create a mathematical representation of the fingerprint, and the formula that uses the fingerprint and creates that mathematical representation is something that can be changed over time. So if you have that database, even in a derived form, if it's something that's changeable, now all of a sudden the risk is nowhere near as great. And in fact, that database doesn't even exist in a centralized form. Everything is done locally on the phone.
On the device,
So these are some of the mechanisms that you can employ from a technology perspective to be able to get those benefits without incurring all of those risks.
Those are all very, very good points. Rob, you mentioned that there's this push for private companies in many ways to collect as much data as possible because it very much isn't regulated on that front. And I think one of the reasons for that is really around AI. So shifting the topic just towards AI specifically, because one of the benefits of collecting more data is that you can have more powerful AI algorithms and methods that are created. However, tied to that as well is just the idea of biases in AI systems, and AI systems are inherently vulnerable to biases and errors because it's introduced by its human makers. And what steps can we be doing to eliminate these sorts of biases?
So I can start. I think that the very first step is the recognition of the problem and evangelization of the need to be able to correct it. So that's already been happening for a number of years now in terms of pointing out the failings of different AI systems as a result of the implicit bias of the creators of those systems. So sometimes they just see the world a certain way because of their own demographic background or psychographic background. It doesn't even occur to them that there would be another way to be able to create that same system. So just by hiring a more representative set of data scientists and machine learning engineers, that's one way of being able to help. But then more explicitly, holding AI to a higher standard in terms of any system that is affecting people's lives, like for example, whether or not somebody is able to get credit. That's an area where you want to make sure that there isn't essentially a defect in the AI system, which is one way of thinking about bias if you just want to be very direct about it, that is being unfair to people. And I can tell you from firsthand experience that this is something that the banking industry is not only thinking very deeply about, but is actually acting on in terms of trying to understand how machine learning systems are making decisions within their environments that could unintentionally impact their customers.
I'll add to what Shuman said with a few points. So the first is, I personally hate using the word AI like writ large because to me it doesn't really have a true definition, and there's so many different aspects, and individuals who are listening may have different interpretations about what we mean at different times. I think typically at this moment most people will talk about machine learning when they're talking about AI, but regardless, and the other reason why that's important, and if we get to this question later on, there's a tendency for individuals who are perhaps a bit less well-read than the folks in this group chat right now, who when they hear AI, they think about artificial general intelligence. And so the notion of a biased or racist artificial general intelligence is very scary, as it should be, whereas a machine learning algorithm is effectively this distorted mirror through which we see our own flaws in a data set that's been collected perhaps by human-generated actions or outcomes, which just amplify this fact that human beings, we stereotype and that we are biased in a lot of our actions. And so with regards to what the good things that can be done, first thing is that you need to be very thoughtful about including a very diverse set of consumers and users as you're developing something. A lot of the work that has come out showing these biased systems has been done through audits from external parties that interrogate a system and then are able to publish something about it and show that, notably there's the work that Joy Bulemi has done out of the MIT Media Lab showing that individuals who have darker skin tones are less likely to be recognized through facial recognition systems. And those external interrogations are incredibly important because it motivates change. But now we're also seeing companies, so I'll use the example of Apple as well, who are beginning to introduce new roles, such as I believe it's called a failure machine learning researcher. So that's having an in-house team who will look to kind of break these systems and find failures within them before the systems are used. Because the other thing to note is that typically individuals who are already marginalized are much more likely to have automated systems or algorithms adversely affect their life and have likely much less of an understanding of that going on, which is incredibly problematic. Ideally, these types of systems will help us create a more equitable future. I think that's a very positive goal because human beings are inherently flawed and we do kind of perpetuate these biases. But naturally, we have this risk that if it's human created data, if the data is not a very representative set of a diverse population, so there's loads of other examples we could use. And if the individuals who are creating the systems haven't had adverse experiences, then through no malicious intent whatsoever, there may be a very adverse or negative outcome on other groups that couldn't have possibly been foreseen by the group who created it as a result of their life experience and their own conceptual frameworks of how the world works. So yeah, to sum up, ideally create jobs, technology jobs like failure machine learning researchers who are trying to tease out these systems, have a more diverse population in the room, and also be aware of the fact that typically human generated data will amplify the biases that already exist in the cultures that we share today, which is one of the great reasons that the human-centered AI lab at Stanford exists, because I think the work that Rob, you and your team will do will be very helpful to a larger community at hopefully mitigating some of these larger risks.
So too.
Rob, do you have additional thoughts on that point?
No, whatever I was going to say, it was amply covered by Shuman and Heather. And as someone who's not a technologist, correcting from within a CS paradigm the problems of AI bias is beyond my skill set, I think. I'll mention something that's more in my skill set just as an element to throw into the discussion, which is that the power of machine learning and AI in general is its predictive accuracy in generating from enormous oceans of data, and then the power of computer processing patterns and predictions that humans alone couldn't or wouldn't be as easy to produce. And what I want to suggest as a philosopher is that one way to understand a problem with AI bias is not just in the ways of like tainted or biased training data or various sort of differential patterns of facial recognition across different groups of humans, but instead as a trade-off between things that we care about as human beings and as societies, where predictive accuracy isn't the only thing. So sometimes what I think, I pose this in the class that I teach on tech ethics: how should a software developer think about the trade-off between predictive accuracy and fairness, privacy, explainability? In other words, if you have to diminish your power of predictive accuracy in order to accomplish a fair outcome or prediction, or you need to be privacy protecting, but in being privacy protecting, you diminish predictive accuracy. Well, right now, my understanding is that since this is done at the level of, in the product development pipeline, it's as if the computer scientist consults his or her gut intuition about how to balance these rival things, rather than having a broader open discussion and framework for refereeing the tensions between predictive accuracy and privacy, fairness, and explainability.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to conclude with one more topic, specifically around the role of government in regulating big tech, and should big tech be more closely regulated? I'm thinking in terms of instances like the proliferation of fake news. That was a hot topic during the 2016 election, and would love to hear your thoughts specifically on the role of government in terms of regulating big tech.
I can kick it off. So there's a lot of challenges that exist with regulating in completely. So the policymaking process is a long one, typically. It was, depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, obviously there's variance, but the rules that were put in place in order to make the rules happened at a time when change was a little bit slower. So there's a massive pacing problem with being able to understand, parroting what Shuman said, you can understand Facebook and then now there's Snapchat. And from one frame of mind, I think it's helpful if you think about policy as like steering a ship. If you're steering the ship incredibly quickly, then people kind of might get toppled, or you might get woozy because you're going back and forth so often, because these things do really evolve and change quickly. So perhaps it's a good thing that typically the rulemaking process is a little bit slower. But with regards to what government's role with big technology should be, or regulating technology, I think there's another philosophical question that lies in, if the regulation is like, you shall not do something. I'm thinking about examples of don't create a certain type of technology. Then you run into an issue of, okay, I can tell Ernestine not to do something. That doesn't mean she won't do it. She just won't tell me about it anymore. So maybe it's still happening, but I have less transparency or less access to information about what's going on. And perhaps that's a bad thing, because then I'm less prepared. But then if she does that, I tell her not to do the thing, she does the thing, and then I find out about it, at least there's recursive action that can be taken because I told her not to do it. So I think that's sort of interesting in terms of like the big question of like, should you have a rule-making system about what you can and cannot do? Naturally, technology can be used in a lot of different ways. So then there's all these different applications. And so you really need to regulate the application or the specific use case as opposed to the tool itself. So there's such a variance of ways that, even using the example of data, that you could use the same data piece in different areas. You really need to think about the use case. And I've been on kind of both sides in the sense, like, I was an entrepreneur who's like, government's slow, they can't do anything. And I work in tech and we move fast and it's awesome. And then I went to the other side and I was in government and was humbled to sort of understand the larger systems at play and all the different stakeholders who also need to be consulted. Because at the end of the day, when you make a rule and you don't talk to everybody who wants to be talked to about making the rule, that kind of makes it a little bit harder. And You don't want to make a bad rule because there's so many adverse effects that can be created unintentionally as a consequences of policies that are created. And so that really takes me to my kind of key point in that ideally you do want to have more of a sort of partnership with groups. I think there's a lot of finger pointing that happens. So yes, it's fantastic that a large technology company will come forth and be like, oh, government, like you need to do something. But then there's a bigger challenge in that most people don't actually know what to do. And you need to be cognizant that the largest sort of density of people who are involved in the policymaking process tend to be lobbyists. But realistically, what is their true interest in being involved in these discussions? So it's a very challenging problem. I think as a citizen, I am encouraged to see that there's been more of a recognition of how important certain technologies are by both the people who are creating them, by new research fields that are being produced, by academic institutions like Stanford being able to come forward and fund research to kind of help give more guidelines that are less perhaps biased in terms of what needs to be done. Because the other kind of ridiculous outcome, again, kind of using like more of a startup hat, when you're in government, you don't have a target market anymore necessarily. Like, you know, in theory, you're trying to produce something that's good for everybody. And in business, you'd never even try to do that because you know that you can't build something that everybody will agree with or like. And you also don't need to kind of manage everything. So I guess to close off my piece on this, and then I'm very curious to see what Shuman and Rob have to say. Yes, government should be involved in regulating of technology. Ideally, I think academia actually has a very important role to play in this because of the ability in academia to be reasonably unbiased. And there will be a pacing problem now and for the foreseeable future because the rate of technological advancement simply outpaces the policymaking process. And the other kind of challenge therein lies that you can have a policy, but actually enforcing it is incredibly difficult. So even if you have come to a conclusion and followed the proper consultative process to create a new rule, let's say, then properly policing and enforcing that rule is another challenge in and of itself, and that involves resources. And if we're talking about government, that means tax dollars. So there's just lots of stuff in there, but I'll just leave it at that and see what Shuman and Rob have to say.
Go ahead, Shuman.
I agree with what Heather said in particular about it being a long and difficult process to create laws. And one of the primary difficulties you would have in the area of fake news is defining it. So if you went to a bunch of different members of the House or the Senate and asked them to define fake news and pointed at specific articles and asked whether or not this was fake news, you wouldn't necessarily have a lot of consensus. And so it's difficult to be able to then tell tech companies that they have to enact a policy that is going to be implemented in a consistent fashion if you can't even decide what the right answer is. So I think that what you can do is come to consensus on broad principles, and you can also try and implement different types of controls that will influence behavior. So for example, when you look at the medical profession, we don't allow anyone to perform surgery on other people. You have to go through a great deal of school and licensing, and that's the way that we limit risk that's associated with someone potentially being a bad or even an unethical surgeon. And the consequence of that is that those high standards actually limit the amount of innovation that occurs in that area. If we allowed anyone to be a surgeon, guaranteed we would have more innovation when it came to surgery, but it would come at a cost that we were not willing to pay. On the other hand, we are willing to let 12-year-olds design systems that become extremely popular and used by millions of people. So when it comes to computer technology. So I don't think that that's something that we want to say is going to be illegal. I think that we want to try and figure out how to be able to encourage that innovation, but also inform society about what to think about new technologies, to think about the relationship with new technologies. And, you know, the internet is so relatively young compared to the history of the human race. I think that we're still trying to figure out exactly what it means when new technologies are introduced that never existed yesterday. And we've been very enthusiastic about adopting them because of the benefits that they could bring. But only in the last decade or so, I think, are people thinking on a very widespread basis about the long-term implications of a new technology and asking questions about, well, what data do you need from me? What are you going to do with it? And who's got oversight over you?
That's great. I'll just add one more short thought. I described myself before as a philosopher, but what I'm going to say is just like Econ 101 here. So a direct answer to your question, Ernestine, do we need more regulation of technology or tech companies? In that general sense, regulation isn't desirable just because it's something that government does, or because if it seems like we have a little, we should want to have more. Regulation from the government comes into being in response to certain types of problems that the market often can't solve for itself. So the economic language for this is that a company can produce a negative externality. It has an internal incentive to continue producing that externality, and it has negative consequences for third parties that it won't have any reason to correct for. So the government comes in to try to get the company or the market to internalize that externality. Let's use your example of fake news. If it turns out to be true, as I think the evidence shows, that on social network platforms, the circulation of extreme views and titillation and fake news is highly engaging to users, which leads them to spend more time on the platform, which leads to more revenue for the companies, then what we find is increasing time on platform and engagement with material that often involves fake news or extreme information, extreme views, produces this civic externality. Our information ecosystem for deliberating with one another is poisoned by the internal business incentive for companies to show us this material. So that's a case for government regulation to get companies to internalize this externality. It still has the problems Shuman pointed to. How do we define fake news? How do we figure out what to do? But fake news does offer a case for government regulation. And by the way, I'd offer a further reflection on this as a political scientist now, not as an economist, which is that you see Mark Zuckerberg or others say, we would love for the government to tell us what information we should no longer surface on the platform. And you see, contrary to expectation in certain ways, some of the leaders of tech platforms calling for regulation. Why is that the case? Because it's so obvious that our civic sphere has been poisoned by some of these companies that they'd like no longer to be blamed for it, and they can shift the blame to the government for having set the regulations, which will then bind all the players. But the government loves to be able to call Mark Zuckerberg into the Senate hearing and rake him over the coals for the crap that his platform produces. That poisons the civic sphere. So we have a sort of stalemate there, where the incentive is for the government not to get into the game because they can conveniently blame Silicon Valley for some of the problems at the moment. So we need to have more, forward-looking, less self-interested politicians that can step up to the plate to try to solve a real problem for society, in tandem, as Heather said, with the people who have some expertise, which are often in the tech companies themselves.
I think we have still a lot of unanswered questions and no real solution yet for it. And we only really touched the surface and won't go down the winded path of also talking about government regulation when it comes to antitrust laws, and also Elizabeth Warren's proposal to break up Amazon, Facebook, Google. And I think there's just so many other topics we still need to cover. But I do want to turn it over to everyone else. Ken, do you want to start first?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for the great talk on data security. So my question is more related to GDPR. And I think in terms of GDPR, there's a lot of controversy on whether it should relax some of its requirements on data security. And I think the regulators were also stepping in to clarify some of the requirements. So I was wondering, what's the implication of coronavirus on GDPR, and how do you think GDPR will change or be challenged going forward? Thank you.
I can start. When GDPR was launched, it was a relatively new type of policy. And so I think while they spent about 5 years putting it together, and there's a lot of back and forth with large companies in terms of knowledge that this was something that was going to be implemented, there was still a ton of questions about how it would actually be operationalized. There's been a lot of cases brought forward. Some massive fines have been doled out. But I will say that it's something that is absolutely evolving. And to see the EU calling for more access to information through, I believe they're calling for an app, kind of speaking directly to Shuman's earlier point about something that I guess would be very easy to walk away from at the culmination of this period in time. I think it's reasonable to assume that there'll be some changes that are made to GDPR as it sort of evolves. But I, at this point, would not really be able to provide any guidance on what that could possibly look like. I'm interested to see if Rob or Shuman have thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what legal changes might come about as a result of the current situation. I think that those discussions are definitely being had, though, in terms of all tech companies are looking around at the different data that's out there and how it could, and governments in particular are looking around at the data that the tech companies have that could be used to help with this. And I'm sure that we're going to encounter some potential uses of data in the coming weeks that we haven't even thought of yet.
Dave, I know you have a question as well.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, it was almost a follow-up. It's part of this GDPR and maybe CCPA and the California one. I'm curious how you guys feel about whether the companies are actually following those rules. They seem to be in different geographies using different kinds of rules and maybe not really following the rules, and how, at least it seems to consumers, that even the Mark Zuckerberg thing that Rob, you were just talking about, it may be a little disingenuous in saying, well, gee, you try to regulate me, or you try to do this, when it seems like it's not very trustworthy, and they're trying to do things behind and not giving up their right to all of the data and the use of the data. So I'm just wondering what your feelings are of that.
I have one. You go first, Kevin. No, you first.
So I think that we can see that just visibly on websites, there is work that is happening in just about every major tech company. All of a sudden, you're seeing warnings and emails that are GDPR specific, that are informing you about what data is being collected and their cookie policies and so on. And now the question is, are they doing everything that's required of them from a GDPR perspective? I think that varies. I think that generally what you find is that most companies do not want to violate the law. They're concerned about what, at the very least, what the financial implications would be from doing that. There are substantial fines that can be levied against them from a GDPR perspective, and they don't want that to happen. And there's a lot of uncertainty that's associated with that as well. Exactly when would those fines be levied, and when would you fall into one category versus another? But I think that it's still early days in terms of understanding exactly how it's going to be enforced. And we have to see examples of that before companies know whether or not there was a gap in their initial strategy. But generally, what I see is that companies took that very seriously, and they dedicated significant resources to ensuring that they were GDPR compliant. Certainly, our company has been thinking about GDPR for a long time, and all of our customers have as well.
One quick thought, Dave, for you on that is that there's a gap, of course, between the passage of legislation or a regulatory framework and the enforcement of the laws or the regulations. And so in the case of GDPR, it may be the case, I'm not sure I have all the details here to memory, but that no company has been fined a significant amount of money as a result of a GDPR violation. I might be wrong about that, but my impression is that enforcement has been far more lax than perhaps initially expected, which then leads to some of the dynamic you described.
I'll add to that as well that with regards to the jurisdictional reach of GDPR, it is from the EU. And so they have control over their citizens and within their own region. Naturally, technology companies tend to operate in a borderless fashion. But you also mentioned the CCPA. It's fascinating to look at the United States and say, okay, there's more of a cross. If it's a state-led approach, it's kind of difficult to have a unified, well, it's state-led, so it's not unified. And there still is no real global consensus on how these systems are run. So perhaps your perspective would be a little bit different if you were completely based in the EU all the time. I don't know if that's where you currently are. But while there is a call for adequacy, so all regions are supposed to reach adequacy with their existing privacy laws, I think there's a challenge in terms of adopting to those areas. And while most governments around the world were motivated as a result of GDPR to have their own response and to try to understand if you're going to go down more. For my conversations in Canada, it was the EU has one approach, the United States has a separate approach. And as we sort of perceived the American approach at that time, it was let the market kind of dictate it and sort of see what happens. And then the EU approach was much more like, let's enshrine privacy as being very important and sort of in the individuals, and we're going to take this stance. And it was very challenging to navigate how we could both maintain adequacy, which would help keep our markets open and protect our businesses, but also understand what our constituents wanted. So what does the Canadian population want? And understanding that is very, very difficult.
William?
Hey, so I have a couple of questions, so I guess you can answer either. So first question is, thinking more about the private sector. So what role do you see for companies like Vanta that are in the data security, data privacy space? Where do you see that ecosystem going in, say, the next 5 years? And alternate question is, what's one thing in the space of AI ethics, data privacy that keeps you up at night?
So I can answer that from the perspective of the private sector. I think that one of the real challenges associated with privacy and security tools, as Heather mentioned earlier, is that people don't prioritize them over convenience and things that have a direct value to their lives outside of protecting them against something undesirable. So with security technologies, there are certainly security enthusiasts and some companies that want what we call the belt and suspenders approach of investing in a wide variety of security technologies to make sure that they're safe. And if they're even somewhat redundant, that's okay, because safety is the priority. So you think about financial services, and it's an existential threat for a hacker to be able to steal all of the money inside of a bank. And so the banks want to make sure that they do everything that's possible to avoid that from happening. When it comes to privacy, I think that when you ask consumers in general whether or not privacy is something which is important to them, the answer is usually yes. And then when you watch their behavior, the answer is they never think about privacy in the context of most of their actions. And so it's really difficult to be able to go to someone and say, here is a privacy tool that you have to pay extra money for, that you have to then put additional effort into integrating into your life in order to protect you against something that you may or may not view as a real threat. So I think that there is a real opportunity for privacy to be advanced from a technology perspective in a way that it improves the lives of the vast majority of people. And that's generally for it to be baked into the platforms that we use and to be enabled by default. So I gave the example before of HTTPS on Gmail. Another example is Touch ID and Face ID, most widely used biometric technologies in the world for authentication purposes because of the fact that they're built into the iPhone. I think that building in new security and privacy capabilities into platforms that are widely used in such a way that they're easy to use, so that the use becomes implicit as opposed to something that users have to take additional action for, if it can actually improve their lives while also improving privacy and security in some way, then that's the way that you get mass adoption. And so I think that when you're talking about specialist companies from a privacy or security perspective, they're often looking to partner with those types of platforms and distribute through those platforms. And that's often the go-to-market motion that they can have in order to be able to have the broadest possible impact. And in many cases, they end up being acquired by those platforms. And from an AI perspective, your second question, what keeps me up at night from an AI ethics perspective? I think that the difficulty that's associated with the advances in AI is that they can come from anywhere. And they can start off with a certain intent and then be used for the opposite of that intent or for a completely different purpose. So, for example, I'm sure that you're all familiar with Captcha, which are the squiggly letters that you have to type in when you log into a website and authenticate you're human, or saying that this is a fire hydrant or this is a storefront. And the intent of that technology is to be able to protect you. And computer vision technology has advanced a great deal in parallel with those security technologies, to the point that you can now use optical character recognition technology and other forms of computer vision technology to be able to solve those captchas. And that's exactly what cyber criminals do. They use those AI techniques against the security controls that are put on by websites. And Google did a study a few years ago that showed that machine learning-based optical character recognition had a 99.8% solve rate for CAPTCHAs. And meanwhile, human beings had about a 33% solve rate. And so what that means is that because of these otherwise benignly intended advances in optical character recognition through AI being used by cyber criminals, our security controls were now doing the opposite of what they were supposed to do. And so I think that that principle applies to any category of AI. And we can say that we're going to have certain standards of conduct in the United States, for example. We're going to have certain ways that AI can or cannot be used or developed. But if that technology exists, it might be used and probably will be used by someone else somewhere in the world for an unintended purpose. And so the question is, how do we control that? And it's really hard. And I think that this is why it's important to have as much education and understanding throughout all of society so that you can have sort of a decentralized approach to protection. When people understand that they're about to use an application or visit a website or interact with some third party that they've never heard of before who might cause them harm.
Heather and Rob, do you have any concluding thoughts you'd like to share?
My quick concluding thought on what keeps me up at night, I think there's a lack of algorithmic empathy that we have in terms of how, at least me as a human, I'm pretty lazy. And so if something is given to me, a response is given to me, an outcome is handed to me, I may not stop and wonder where that outcome came from and what informed it. And so I worry about, by adopting more automated tools to be able to make decisions for individuals, that we could go down a dangerous path in terms of further harming those individuals, or ending up in situations where you're denied something, or you're in a very Orwellian world, overly surveilled, and there's a fault found in you that may be the result of an improperly made system or something that was fed garbage and therefore is garbage. But I think human nature as a tendency is one wherein we may not stop and question and look under the hood about how that came to be. So I guess that sort of speaks to the explainability field. But in terms of my own life, I just know that I'm someone who I have to think about thinking about where responses came from in order to make sure I'm not just blindly following them.
I'm going to be either grandiose or take a philosophical or macro level perspective in answering your question, William, about what keeps me up at night. And I'd say, I think that the current path of AI, and this includes leaving AGI entirely out of the question, just current AI technology, I worry about it being a significant contributor to the deterioration and perhaps even destruction of democracy as such. And that's for two reasons. First, AI systems are responsible for an extraordinary displacement of human labor. So there's this huge technological unemployment challenge that many countries face. And when there are large numbers of people put out of work in a relatively short time span, that's ripe for the sort of nativist, populist political rebellions we've seen. And you get a kind of rise of populist authoritarianism. Hungary, Poland are good examples of where that's tipped over, in my view, beyond democracy, or they've lost democracy entirely. And what's happened here in the United States, or perhaps in the UK and elsewhere, you can see is we're edging down the same path of nativist right-wing populism as a result of a reaction to deep social anxiety about where stable incomes will come from. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is that there might be, as Yuval Harari suggests, a kind of structural advantage to authoritarian regimes who deploy AI because of the decentralized approach of democracy and the centralized architecture of AI systems as they now exist. It gives countries like China, with enormous populations and a massive blurring between the private sector and the government, a huge advantage in developing systems that, frankly, you now see some possible advantage in the face of the current pandemic. So that on its own also gives me reason to worry about whether or not there's a mismatch between the current architecture of AI and democracy and the decentralized nature of its institutional design. And I would think that if I had to choose between advanced AI systems and democracy, I'll go for the democracy rather than the AI.